February 21st, and welcome to World Review, the Chicago Council's weekly look at the news from around the world. Evo, as you can see, is traveling. I'm Carla Anne Robbins, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm also a professor at Baruch College's Marx School in New York, and I'm a former reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, so I have a little bit of street cred for this conversation. Today, we're going to be looking at President Trump's apparent decision to switch sides in the Ukraine war, and after a giddy makeup session, possibly trade in Europe for a new alliance with Moscow. He's already sounding a lot like Putin. He called Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator and falsely, shamefully accused him of starting the war. Then we're going to look at the state of the Gaza war. In a mocking and threatening ceremony on Thursday, Hamas turned over the remains of 3 hostages, including Ariel and Kfir Bibas, who were 4 and under a year old when they were taken captive during the October 7th attacks. The body of their mother, Shiri Bibas, was also supposedly handed over, but early on Friday morning, the Israelis said testing found it wasn't her, and they called it a violation of the utmost severity. With the first stage of the ceasefire deal due to expire in early March, what happens next? Are we even going to make it to then? And does anyone have a serious plan for governing and rebuilding Gaza? And we're going to discuss Xi Jinping's decision to bring his tech bros back in from the cold after 5 years of purgatory. Even Alibaba's Jack Ma is suddenly back in Xi's good graces. And if we have time, I'd like to talk a bit about the Trump administration's latest assault on our profession. The White House is banning the Associated Press from the Oval Office in Air Force One because it's refusing to use the name Gulf of America. How Orwellian can you get? Here with us to discuss all these issues is a great group of journalists from New York. Bobby Ghosh, senior editor of Digital Weekend at Bloomberg. Bobby, great to see you again.
Pleasure.
From London, Prashant Rao, senior editor at Semaphore. Hey, Prashant.
Hey.
And from London, Liz Sly, journalist at large, a title I love, and previously global affairs correspondent for The Washington Post, and a foreign correspondent in Middle East, Africa, China, South Asia, and Europe. And Liz, it is lovely to meet you virtually.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for doing this. So, Bobby, let's start with Ukraine. This isn't the first time Trump has criticized Zelensky. It's not the first time he's praised Putin. He's not the first time he's threatened to abandon NATO. But to me, at least, it felt qualitatively different this week, not least because Zelensky pushed back. He described Trump as caught in a web of Russian disinformation. So how does it feel to you? Is this the end of U.S. support to Ukraine? Is it a temporary Trump fit of pique, or is he bargaining for something?
Well, Trump's allies, those who are shamefaced enough to try and make excuses for him, are trying to tell us that this is just bargaining on his part, that we should not take him literally when he says things like that. But we've heard that variants of that narrative before, and we've been fooled. And so he is the president of the United States. The words he says carry weight, and it is also consistent with his. It's a logical next step in the narrative that he has been building up to for quite a long time now. He is very, very thin-skinned, so responding to relatively mild criticism from Zelensky with sort of over-hyped, over-egged language like he's a dictator and he was responsible for the war. That's to be expected from a person with such thin skin. But I think the crucial question is whether and when, perhaps, he begins to greatly reduce or stop American aid to the Ukrainians. And that will be the key thing. I suspect that Zelensky, who's a sort of well-practiced politician himself and comes from a background in show business, I don't think Zelensky will necessarily be rattled by the use of language like dictator and so on. I think that's something he can brush off his shoulder quite easily. But if the United States stops supporting Ukraine in a material way, that is something that will be much harder. And that's the next step, I suspect, because quite aside from the angry tweets from Trump, the thing that caught my eye was this outreach to the Europeans from the Trump administration to ask them what their likely response would be if they put troops on the ground and the Russians were to attack those troops. So the White House is already composing scenarios in which the United States is pulling out, the Europeans are going in, and the Russians are taking pot shots at those Europeans. And that is something that's sort of much more concrete and represents a far greater threat, I think, to Ukraine than some angry language, petulant language on a tweet or on a social media platform.
So, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz told Fox News yesterday that Zelensky should tone down his criticism. He knows his principle quite well, and he's giving him a little bit of advice there. Don't make him angry. But he also told Zelensky he should take a hard look at this U.S. proposal. I mean, they're not even hiding this at this point. That they want to take $500 billion worth of Ukraine's natural resources in exchange for this continued U.S. protection. I think we used to call that a protection racket. I mean, Bobby, usually this is the literal. Do we take them literally or not? I mean, maybe they really are bargaining for something. Do you take that seriously? That they're really just trying to get they're trying to get the critical minerals and everything else out of Ukraine?
They aren't $500 billion worth of minerals. This figure is imaginary. Those minerals are imaginary. Ukraine does have some minerals, but not the vast trove of rare earths that the Trump administration imagines. The Ukrainians themselves have been looking for it. God knows they need the money. It does not exist. Bloomberg did a deep dive into this earlier this week and sort of basically looked at all the available science and research into what mineral wealth Ukraine has, and it's nowhere near $500 billion. So where that number came from, whether it was plucked out of thin air by the president or one of his advisors, that's my best guess. It's so preposterous that, when a protection racket is usually around something solid, this is around something that is completely imagined. So again, this is the president of the United States. You can't not take him seriously, but he makes it very, very hard.
So, Liz, other quotes that got somewhat less attention, but that blew me away this week were from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. We all know him. He's this longtime Russia hawk, and he's suddenly talking about a multipolar world. And he was talking about, quote, the incredible opportunities that exist to partner with the Russians geopolitically. And of course, after his meetings with the Russians, they were talking about restoring staffing at their embassies, creating high-level teams to talk about Ukraine, and exploring closer relations for economic cooperation. Do you have any idea what the Russians are selling that I'm not getting? I mean, their best and their brightest have fled the country. They have withstood the sanctions. That's true, thanks mainly to the Chinese and well management of their sovereign wealth fund. They have double-digit inflation. Their interest rates are at 20%. They've got massive labor shortages. Is this all about Russian oil, or what is it that the Russians are selling that this administration seems so happy to buy?
Yes, it's hard for me to kind of fathom what amazing business opportunity Russia is, that it's so important to the United States. We're not talking about China here, which is a very, very large market. We're talking about a much smaller market, much smaller than the EU, for example, that doesn't have a lot of purchasing power. So whether it's exports or investments in the country, I don't know. It does seem to be about oil, successive administrations, but this one in particular seemed particularly hung up on the idea of oil. And another thing that's been floated out there is that the Americans are looking for access to the Arctic and the warm water passage across the north of Russia that would put them in, would help them strategically vis-a-vis China. But yes, I seriously wonder what that's about as well.
And Prashant, do you see this? I mean, do you have any idea what they're selling? What the Russians are selling? I mean, to get to
I actually
throw away 80 years of post World War II structure.
I think there is a logic to it. Now, again, like the proviso that you always have to wonder whether there's four-dimensional chess being played or it's just a much simpler game. But I do actually think that there is like some merit to the notion of pulling a reverse Nixon and peeling Russia away from China. And if you were to say that Rubio is a Russia hawk, he is almost certainly more hawkish towards China than he was towards Russia. And his sort of long-held hawkishness towards China has been sort of well documented. Ling Wei had a great sort of piece in the Journal this week. She's maybe the best China reporter going about worries within China. She's extraordinarily well-sourced, worries within China about becoming the sort of number one adversary and the United States being able to concentrate its attention on the Pacific. Bloomberg also had an excellent story just today about this. And, your colleague at CFR, Josh Kurlancic, sort of also rightly points out that, India gets something in the range of like 75% of its, or did until recently, 75% of its military arms from Russia. There are several Asian countries that depend on Russia as a military power and have strong, deep relationship with Russia that are fearful of China. And the idea, that the United States can, no longer have to worry about Russia in this kind of day-to-day thing, and then also be able to commit more of its military resources to the Pacific, which, the Pentagon said during the Trump administration and during the Biden administration that China is the pacing challenge, right? That was the language. And if that is the case, and you also take as granted that the United States does not have the resources to fight a multi-front war, then China is the challenge. And so if you were to prioritize, this is something that can be done. Now, you have to then make the sort of intellectual compromises that are required. And I'm not sort of saying that these are good things to do or not, but I think logic is sort of available to us. The idea as well that asking Europe to do more is also not kind of outrageous to me. The Bruegel, the Brussels think tank, had a report out, I think yesterday, saying that Europe, even just to sort of make it to break even to deter Russia, would need 300,000 more troops and 250 billion euros a year in additional spending. I mean, the European military, like Reuters has a story this week saying that Germany's military is less capable than it was in 2022. I mean, there's some astonishing things happening to European militaries that have largely sort of ceded defense and security responsibilities to the United States. And I mean, there is the thing about being outraged about what Trump says, but as he did in his first administration, like the things he reveals about the inadequacies of global geopolitics are, worth, I think, discussing.
Well, I think your point about wouldn't it be great if we could peel Russia off from China? I mean, he's certainly not the first American president to be outraged by free riders. I mean, every American president has been outraged by free riders with the Europeans. He, of course, will take credit. I'll give Vladimir Putin a lot more credit for Europe being aware of its own inadequacies, even if they haven't done enough about it. I think this goes back to a really basic question. Okay, let's try to peel Russia off from China. But could you possibly trust the Russians to not do it again? I mean, we're peeling Russia off from China. We have a great peace deal here in which we give them a big chunk of Ukraine. It's going to take the Europeans how many years to rebuild? We're going to not guarantee Article 5 while all of this is going on. And who's next, Moldova or the Balts? And so great geopolitical opportunity there. At the same time, they're not doing what these conversations were about, which is they're not guaranteeing, as Bobby was saying, they're not guaranteeing European security here, let alone Ukraine's security. So yes, I would love to believe that they're great geopolitical planners here. But if you're not going to strengthen NATO along the way and strengthen Ukraine along the way, what's the point of peeling them off from China? I mean, Liz, what do you think?
But there's
on that note, I totally agree with your point. There's a great essay by James Meek in the London Review of Books this week where he has this excellent line where he says that living in London, it's kind of hard to grapple with how much of an enemy America has become to its friends. And I've been thinking about that sort of a lot this week.
Yes, and there was a column in the Financial Times by the great Gideon Rachman that said we have to now start thinking of the United States as an adversary of Europe. I'm not buying the peeling China away from Russia argument for this bizarre turn that Trump has taken towards China. It might make sense if some other things were there, such as a sensible plan to team up with China with Russia in the first place, such as a sensible economic plan, such as a sensible plan to end the war in Ukraine. And there are a lot of people who think that the war in Ukraine does need ending on some terms, but there's no sensible plan discernible at all, apart from being very nice to Russia and saying everything at once. And meanwhile, I think that the days of like Russia and China being adversaries, they're not both run by rival communist parties anymore, all that kind of thing. They don't have rival ideologies. It might make sense to Rubio, who, as Prashant points out, is much more of a China hawk than he is a Russia hawk. But apart from him embracing this, I'm not even sure Trump is a China hawk. He's talking about doing a great trade deal with Xi. He's talking about all the economic relations between the two countries. I think Trump is against China to the extent that it has unfair competition practices that disadvantage American businesses. He can get some deal on that front. I don't know how hawkish he's going to be on China.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And there are two other things to consider. One is that there's absolutely no indication that Russia wants to be peeled away from China, or that it would make economic sense for Russia to be peeled away from China. China is a giant market that Russia craves as much as American companies do. And there is a closer relationship between Moscow and Beijing now than there has ever been in my lifetime. So even if that were something that if you try to game that out, that does not end in any way that would be to America's advantage. And the second point is that if this were the only thing that was happening in Trump's overall foreign policy position, then we could accord it a certain degree of seriousness. But you have to look at all the other things that are going on, the badgering and bullying and frankly, just open threatening of America's allies, the trips that the defense secretary and the vice president, the speeches they've given in Europe, the dismantling of the State Department and other instruments of American sort of international outreach. All of these things are this whole business about Russia and China is not happening in isolation. It's part of a larger pattern, and when you look at that larger pattern, it's impossible to attribute any kind of sort of logic to the Russia outreach because it seems to be much more destructive than constructive in its approach.
Hard to see strategy. I mean, they didn't go to the G20 meeting. I mean, they're the only ones that didn't go to the G20 meeting.
One small piece of logic that I see in some of what's been, of all the crazy contradictory things that have been said over the past week, and that is the Rubio comments on like the multipolar world and the spheres of influence. If you think about it, I'm wondering if, I mean, I have no idea what Trump's thinking. I don't think any of this. But if you're thinking in the terms of a multipolar world and spheres of influence, then you've got Russia, its sphere of influence is Europe. He's made it clear he's not very interested in Europe. You've got China, its sphere of influence is Asia. And you've got America, its sphere of influence is the Americas. And the countries that Trump is most directly threatening, like Mexico, Panama, and Canada, are in his sphere of influence. I can't help feeling he wants to like do a Putin and invade somewhere and look big. And what we could be seeing is an American retreat from the world that creates this multipolar world of three spheres of influence in which Trump, Xi, and Putin decide what happens in the world.
Damn, I speak Spanish. It's going to be relevant again. Okay, let's move on to Gaza. It's real. I'm not sure that that's what they meant when they talked about multipolar. But when all the other guys talked about multipolar, they meant getting rid of U.S. influence. When Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, starts embracing the term multipolar, he's not talking about empowerment of other powers. He's not talking about, it's almost as if he didn't read. It's almost as if they didn't read. But okay, let's move on. Let's talk about something really. Another war and another set of tragedies. So, Liz, this handover of the Bibas family is, with the remains of these two small children, it was always going to be incredibly agonizing in Israel. That Hamas ceremony was incredibly mocking, and also a reminder that Hamas is very much there and present. And this mix-up over the mother's body, whether it was a mix-up or I doubt it was intentional, but who knows? It made it far, far worse. And then on Thursday night, 3 buses exploded in Tel Aviv in the area of Tel Aviv in a parking lot, and luckily nobody was hurt. And immediately, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu's office announced that it had ordered a, quote, a massive operation in the West Bank targeting militants. I mean, that's how one tells from day to day. There's constant operations in the West Bank. Are we even going to make it through the first phase of the ceasefire? What happens then? And is there anybody talking in any way about where we go from here? seriously?
Well, yes, until the mix-up over the bodies, and also today they're very, very agitated about the fact that they say the two small children were murdered and not killed in an airstrike, as Hamas said, and the spokesman was on just now calling this a very, very serious violation. Until then, we were looking at a reasonably optimistic scenario for the extension of the ceasefire. Or at least for an extension of the ceasefire rather than moving to phase two. We're obviously not ready to move to phase two, which is negotiations for a permanent ceasefire and a pathway to a Palestinian state. We're obviously really long way away from that. But there was talk of extending the ceasefire, and that seemed plausible because well, at least there's pressure from the Arab states who now want to come up with their own workable plan for Gaza. How they will do that, I don't know, but they're starting a series of high-level meetings today to come up with their own plan. And Stephen Witkoff, it seems to be extremely determined to continue the ceasefire, and he's proved to be a bit of an enforcer, and he seems to be able to pressure Netanyahu, at least in a way that the Biden administration couldn't. So I think people were kind of expecting that the ceasefire, which expires on March 1st, would be extended to allow for more steps. And once you've extended it once, you can extend it twice, as we've recently seen in Lebanon. So that's where we were. But I think we're too much in the eye of the storm at the moment over the circumstances of the return of the 3 hostages' bodies yesterday. Know whether that's going to blow the whole thing up and reignite the war, or whether it's going to be something that's smoothed over with new negotiations for an extension.
So the whole Saudi-Trump dynamic is sort of hard to get my brain around, and also the fact that the Saudi meeting is going to culminate in an Arab League meeting. I mean, the whole notion of an Arab League plan almost sounds like an oxymoron myself, but forgive me, but I've never seen the Arab League produce anything. I mean, are you taking, Liz, seriously the notion that they really can potentially come up with an idea that would be enough to counterbalance Gaza-Lago, and that they are finally going to step up?
It's really, really impossible. I mean, it's so hard to see that. I don't know what that plan would involve. They could commit a lot of money, and maybe we're in a slightly Europe scenario there, where putting out outrageous statements makes people hurry up to open up their purses. And I could definitely see that happening. But you've got the whole problem of how to solve the issue of a permanent creation of a Palestinian state, which the Saudis will not let go of. This is a 75-year-old problem. It would take 75 years to explain all the steps that have gone wrong and all the missteps and all the different scenarios that could be had. The main scenario is that there's no discernible government or group or party or people who could take over Gaza and run it in the absence of Hamas, which very much isn't absent, as we've seen. So I'm not optimistic about the Arabs coming up with anything, but I'm reasonably optimistic that they will start seriously talking about it in a way that will defer perhaps further action for now. And Trump seems to like the Saudis and admire them, so he might be listening to them.
Well, that's. I do want to get to that very quickly, but before that, Bobby, you've written you don't want to wait to come up with a structure, and it's time now. And you've also written the notion, I think, as I recall, the notion that we're not going to get rid of Hamas, so we have to sort of think about, what do you think about the future of Hamas in Gaza?
Well, I can't see Hamas doing what, let's say, the PLO did in Lebanon all those years ago, which is get on planes and ships and sail off to Libya or Algeria or some other parts unknown. Hamas is too large, too integrated into Gaza society to be able to extract in that way. And even if Hamas were to say today, it's highly unlikely that, we are dissolving. Who's going to believe that? Would the Israelis believe it? And I don't think they would, and neither would the Saudis or the Egyptians or the Emiratis. So that seems to me like a fool's errand to be chasing after that. I'm not at all confident that the Arab states will open their purses, and indeed, why should they? And offer to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza, or to accept Trump's fantasy of moving the entire population, Palestinian population, into Jordan and Egypt. So the Arabs already have a plan. They've been pushing a plan for years, and any plan that they come up with now, at best, will be a retread of that one. It'll have the same basic principles. It may be gussied up a little bit for Trump's benefit, but the Israelis will know all the basic tenets of that plan long before the Arabs put any pen to paper. So this seems to me like, as Liz says, if anything, this will be a chance to slow things down a little bit, maybe act as a kind of as an incentive to prolong the ceasefire and push the can or kick the can down the road, as we like to say in this country, for a little bit longer. But the positions of all the parties involved are already well known. There's nothing I've seen to suggest that there's going to be any change in those positions. The American position, the Israeli position, the Hamas position, or indeed the position of the Arab states.
And can I just add something there? I think Trump rather foolishly preempted any possible solution that does involve the evacuation of Hamas to Libya or Algeria or whatever, with his plan to remove all the Palestinians. The Palestinians and Hamas are now going to say, that's the end game. Whatever they say to us, the end game is getting us all out. That's going to make it much more likely that nobody will leave, even if it made sense for the Palestinians and for Hamas to have an evacuation deal, like you had for the PLO, which did result eventually in the triumphant return of Arafat to the West Bank. An evacuation is not the end of the world for Hamas. It could have been done. It won't be now.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's really, really interesting. Prashant, last thought on this before we move on to China?
I mean, I'm not sure I have anything sort of substantive to add. It's just, from an emotional point of view, it's incredibly hard to be anything but downbeat about the prospects for any longer-term peace arrangement. As Bobby said, 2002 was when the Arab Peace Initiative came. We know what the contours of a deal are. We know how to look. We know, these sort of questions are over the broad kind of administration and sort of how an administration is composed. But even with that, the idea that Hamas will not be part of it would be in name only, surely. And so, we know what the deal looks like. We've known what the deal looks like for more than 20 years. And so there's not going to be any surprises out of this summit. Aside from, the one key difference from 2002, obviously, is that the Gulf is a much bigger player in international regional diplomacy than it was at any point. Even though, 2002 was a Saudi peace initiative, Saudi carries so much more heft in the region than it did, 20, 25 years ago. And so that perhaps changes some of the dynamics, in that Iran is so defenestrated and Saudi is so much more powerful that this is no longer a regional competition between those two countries, because that has largely been decided, de facto. But the pieces of paper will not change, because the deal has been known for decades now.
And you have, when you talk about sort of the competition for influence with Donald Trump, and I don't think they have a grand strategy as much as they thought they did with the Abraham Accords, which was interesting. Probably the only sort of big strategy out of the first administration is Trump obviously really likes the Saudis. And when you just think about the last week about how the Saudis are asserting themselves, Ukraine, sovereign wealth funds, there's Russia. There's just all this stuff that they're, really involved in. Golf, the Trump family investment. You could see how, they're the sort of people. I don't know if you remember that him dancing with the orb in the first term when he went there, the big gold necklaces, and you could see that. But at the same time, he's also, very much in it with Netanyahu. So we'll see how those two parts are pushing and pulling with it. But the Hamas, Hamas got what it wanted on October 7th. It really blew up any possibility of a big, Saudi-Israeli deal or anything of the sort. The whole thing is just, the tragedy just keeps on and on. Let's talk technology. Prashant, the president had all of the big names in American tech gathered around him at his inauguration. And this past week, China's Xi Jinping invited his elite of the China's tech world to a very rare discussion. And this is 5 years after Chinese regulators cracked down on the tech sector, including blocking the world's biggest IPO, which was going to be this $34 billion initial public offering for Jack Ma's Ant Group. And Ma had criticized the government and accused their Chinese regulators of stifling innovation, and he basically disappeared from public view for a very long time. And this week, Ma was out there front and center. And she also notably shook the hand of the founder of DeepSeek, and that was the AI company that is Silicon Valley absolutely freaking out. So why is she reaching out now? And has he really decided to let, Liz, I apologize, you're a China expert, is he letting a whole bunch of flowers bloom in the, okay, I won't do it. Is he letting the tech sector, is he unleashing the tech sector in China, or is this just temporary?
I guess as with all things China, no one has sources in the Politburo, so we should be humble about what we know as to Xi Jinping's mind and his sort of strategy, because he has more power than any Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping and arguably since Mao, and no one has a direct line to him. But, the things I've been thinking about is it's interesting who was there. As you said, DeepSeek was there, Jack Ma was there, and Reng Junfei of Huawei were there. And that sort of tells me a few things. One is, DeepSeek is largely until December was a sort of among Chinese sort of tech and deep China watchers, a company that was understood but not fully known as to the depth of its capabilities. But what it did was obviously a buoyant moment for Chinese technology and disrupted Western stock markets, but not really the investment plans of big tech. I think we should be cautious about how much DeepSeek has changed. I mean, it's changed the perception of Chinese technology, but, Microsoft, Google, AWS, Apple have all continued and actually ramped up their investment plans for artificial intelligence data centers. And so if anything, they're not perhaps not changing the course yet. Reng Junfei, if we were to talk about how buoyant Chinese tech feels, he's this sort of founder and sort of head of Huawei. He said to sort of Chinese language media, and hasn't really been talked about in the Western press, is the next 5 years offer what he said was a window of life or death for Chinese technology. So this sense of urgency is, I think, really kind of there. And I think a lot about actually sort of among the things that Joe Biden did that was the most seminal decisions that, correctly gets covered, but I don't think is thought about as much in terms of foreign policy, is the chip controls of October 7th in his term are just astonishing in how they've reshaped the U.S.-China relationship. And I think so much of how China is focused on technology is largely because of those chip controls. And having concentrated minds in Beijing that this is a tech race that until those October 7th of October 2022 chip controls came through, Chinese companies were freely buying from American, Dutch, and Japanese kind of equipment suppliers and selling to Americans. That having been gone has entirely concentrated, the buys. China had Made in China 2025 as a significant kind of policy platform that she did promote, but nowhere near as significant and as dedicated as this chip push has been. And, this comes against this backdrop of economic growth that's flagging, right? It's slowing to sort of official rates of 5%, though I'm not sure any sort of serious analyst of China believes that's what the actual number is. Youth unemployment is persistently high, somewhere in the range of the high teens is the general sort of assumption, even though official numbers are slightly lower than that. And the real estate sector is riddled with debt and problems. And corruption remains a significant problem in the PLA. I think it is easy to think that China is on an inevitable rise and will challenge the United States. And actually, a lot more of the data suggests that it is not as straightforward. It is not as linear. And the sort of policy challenges that presents for the United States are possibly even more complex, because a fading China is maybe more of a threat than a sort of surging China, because it may well be that Xi Jinping, again, with the proviso that we don't know what he thinks, may well think that he doesn't have the time and that he has to strike faster. And so I think we should be a little cautious as to what all of this means. There are so many potential scenarios out there as far as I can see.
Liz, that's a lot. Thank you for that. Liz, it was a very tough few years for the tech sector in China. I mean, they've been beating up on them, including holding some of them hostage. And it's sort of hard to read, as Prashant said, what this meeting meant. But do you see that she is prepared to really impose some rule of law for the tech sector to stop taking these people hostage, to start lending to them again, to give some regularity, because that means a lot for their tech sector, means a lot for competition, for in a good way, potentially a bad way, means a lot also for potential for American investment in China. Are they going to regularize business in China, or is this just sort of, who knows?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to clarify that I am not a China expert. I was based in China in the late 90s.
Okay.
And I left in 2000. And everybody back then, the only discussion at the dinner tables and the dinner parties and in the bars, of which there weren't that many back then, was, where is this talk of the Asian century going to lead us? Where is this China advice going to lead? I don't think any of us had foreseen back then that it would lead to what we have now in China. Everybody was thinking there would be natural breaks to it, or it would become like a democracy, which was the hope of like the successive US administrations, that you encourage free trade with China and invest like crazy, and it goes to liberal democracy. And the reverse is true. And Xi has become a real like traditionalist, hardcore, authoritarian strongman, and even changed the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, which traditionally was very communisty and communal, being in the sense that they shared decision-making and reached consensus. He doesn't do that anymore. I'm inclined to see this tech gathering as a little bit of a reaction to the inauguration of Trump, both in terms of Trump's arrival and sort of declaration of war, if you like, potential trade war and competition with China, and to the very specific nature of the of all the tech bros gathering at Trump's inauguration and making him look good, and that they thought, oh, we can do that too. I gather he had a similar meeting with all the tech leaders at the Great Hall of the People in 2018, and it was after that that they all got into like bad books and clamped down on and everything. So I'm inclined to see this as a bit of a show and not necessarily indicating anything new or any new directions. However, I think it's that the arrival of Trump and DeepSeek and the relationship that Trump has, like with Elon Musk and the tech leaders in America, has reminded Xi that these people are assets in the war of competition over trade and business and dominance with America, and that he should start deploying them. Let's see if anything actually changes.
Bobby, what do you think? Do you think that things are going to change inside of China?
I'll start where Prashant did, which is to say that, you know, where this is even harder than criminology, reading of the tea leaves from back in the day, because there's so little leaking from the top in China. It's very hard to know. That said, the spectacle of Xi surrounded by his tech warriors, if that's the right expression. You made the parallel with Trump and all those tech bros at his inaugural. I think the key difference was, in Trump's case, it was his way of saying, look who supports me. In Xi's case, it was his saying, I support these guys. That was the message, that I've if anything, that, you know, I brought them out from the cold and they're once again in my good graces. At least that's the interpretation most people are making of it. But the thing that I'm curious about, and Prashant and maybe Liz can get into this a little bit, is, was that primarily meant for an international audience, or was that meant for a domestic audience? Because Jack Ma was, of course, you know, a very well known and highly regarded internationally, but he was also a little bit of a cult hero in China, and his long period out in the cold will have sort of been noted by the Chinese. Bringing him back in from that cold, what is the message that is being sent to the domestic audience, and is that the primary audience for this spectacle, or is it really meant for an international audience? So I'd be curious to hear what Prashant and Liz have to say about that.
Prashant?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about my understanding of the Communist Party is because it is so much bigger than we fully grasp, right? And we have to sort of parse between the party and the state and be careful not to sort of say that they're analogous to each other, is actually that these spectacles are, yes, for international consumption, and we can sort of try and, as Bobby correctly said, read the tea leaves about what he's trying to say to us, as a kind of analyst, diplomatic, journalistic class, but also it does serve a real important internal purpose. These ideas that there's the reason that sort of Xi Jinping speeches will be released 4 years after the fact, and that's the first we see of them, because they are indicating to the internal Communist Party apparatus of how the party is shifting. What is it telling them? Because these, the way it'll happen is there will be information releases, then study sessions, and then further kind of understanding, right? And so as a result, he is disseminating information within the Communist Party system to some degree. So there is an element of, as Bobby said, you can come back into the cold, back in from the cold. This is not, it need not be, a forever purging. There is an element of, private businesses au fait again after years in which it did not seem to be, and the state was growing. Now, whether he is saying this from strength or from weakness is interesting, right? Because, by and large, Chinese state governments are horrifically in debt after years of the pandemic and overspending on security apparatuses. And so, there is a requirement for private enterprise to grow and to expand. But the kind of what it sort of indicates to what the Communist Party should be doing and how it should be expanding. It's interesting that this comes, if you don't read it already, there's a great sort of China-focused magazine called The Wire, which has, I think, a sister publication called China Books Review. And they had this excellent kind of couple of reviews of a new biography that just came out of Hu Yaobang, who was the sort of Communist Party leader before Deng Xiaoping, talks about how, that plus a forthcoming biography of Xi's father really tell us about how these leaders operate, that this is not kind of, in contrast to the US president, it is not kind of sort of fire from the seat of your pants kind of diplomacy or policy. This is very considered. This meeting had real signals, both internationally and domestically, and we should be really thinking about who was in that meeting. What are the speeches that have come out? All of this, I think, will be poured over in the next few weeks.
So can you guys indulge me just in the last few minutes, and can we talk very briefly about this AP phenomenon here? So obviously everybody who's listening, who's not a journalist, knows what the Associated Press is, and because they call elections, and there's the AP Style Book, which people know. You don't have to be a journalist to use the AP Style Book, but it's a cooperative, it's a nonprofit, and their stories and their photographs, their video are used all across the country and all over the world, and we all own it. Those are people who subscribe to it, and it's been around for a very, very long time. And their decision not to use the term Gulf of America has led them to be, frozen out of some one press event, frozen out of the Oval Office, frozen out of traveling on Air Force One, which is a big deal. And I'm just absolutely shocked by this. And what happened was the White House Correspondents Association organized this letter of 40 news organizations, including the Times and the Post and CNN. I don't know if Bobby, did Bloomberg sign it? I don't know if you know whether Bloomberg signed it. And they sent it over. The Reporters Committee also sent a letter. But interestingly, they didn't publicize it. It leaked. We only found out about it when Status reported on this. This softly approach, when we see the way that thin skin, and we were talking about this earlier about President Trump, this softly approach, maybe tactically it makes sense, but when the First Amendment is under attack, is that really the way we're supposed to be dealing with it? I think I'm going to start with Bobby. Bobby, you were a news executive. What do you think? How should this be dealt with?
Well, I've seen this happen in other countries where authoritarian...
Why I'm starting with you.
where authoritarian regimes single out individual media houses and attack them and hope that has a chilling effect across the rest of the media landscape. I don't want to second guess why the decision was made to do this sort of, as you say, to take this sort of soft approach rather than quiet approach, rather than a full confrontation. I'm going to assume the people who made those decisions, I'm not a Washington journalist. I'm not entirely sure how how it works there. And I have to assume that people who made this decision made it on on a more sophisticated understanding of how Washington politics works, how this particular and these are people who have seen the first Trump administration, know the principles involved, and so I'm just I assume that they know what they're doing. But it is certainly astonishing that something so trivial should be the argument for this. It's part of a larger and wider pattern of behavior, which is to undermine the traditional mainstream media outlets and to privilege right-wing, quite often niche publications. We've seen that happen with the first Trump administration, and even more so with the second Trump administration. And if I've learned anything from my experiences in other parts of the world, it doesn't work. Once an administration of this nature has made up its mind to pursue this as a course of action, I don't think they can be talked out of it, because in their mind, very quickly it becomes a matter of faith and prestige, and they would be loath to do what they would regard as a climb down and allow themselves to change their mind, and that's really, really what we're facing here. Basically, they needed to make an example of somebody so that everybody else would learn the lesson, and they chose the AP, which is an odd choice. The AP is not political in any way, as you say. It's really a cooperative. It's a really peculiar target to attack. But I'm not optimistic that that's going to change, unless sort of Trump wakes up in the morning or has one of his 3 a.m. What is it that he drinks, the sort of Diet Cokes, and decides that I need to go to pick somebody else and attack them about something else, and then he changes his mind. But I'm not optimistic.
Interestingly, Newsmax and Fox News also signed the letter, so defending the First Amendment. Prashant, Liz, quickly, what do you guys think? Do you think a more frontal, somebody who, the nonprofit that owns the Philadelphia Inquirer, the head of it said that we should have a Article 5 for news organizations, that there should be collective action, something of the sort. Liz, what do you think?
Well, yes, the Atlantic had a headline, "This is not a hill to die on." The Washington Post countered that with a headline, "This is a hill to die on." I think freedom of the media and freedom of speech is always a hill to die on. And I think this is just the beginning of a slippery slope, and we're going to see many more attacks on the media. Some of them insidious, some of them seemingly over small issues. But I think if the media doesn't band together and start pushing back against all of this now, it's going to get much worse for everybody.
Prashant, last word for you, and thank you, Liz. Sorry.
I couldn't have said anything better than what Bobby and Liz have said, and I sort of associate myself with everything they've said. Not sure I have anything to add.
Yeah, we will watch this. I am a longtime Washington reporter, and I'm absolutely amazed by this. I'm not criticizing the White House Correspondents Association, but I consider this is incredibly chilling, and this really is a First Amendment issue. We lose this, and we lose the whole game. So that's it for this week's edition of World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to thank Prashant Rao of Semaphore, Liz Sly, journalist at large, and Bobby Ghosh of Bloomberg. Eva will be back next week. We hope to see you all here then. Stay safe, everyone. And really, Bobby, Prashant, Liz, it was really a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.